Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I am Cole Altum. This is Jacob Shapiro. Jacob, how you doing?
It's a beautiful Monday morning.
It is a beautiful Monday morning. It's a busy Monday morning, and then it's not just the comings and goings of the world, although it's partly that. We'll get to that in just one second. There's also just the basic exigencies of our commercial enterprise. That's neither here nor there.
It's actually there because I think the reader should know that there's a special report coming out soon, which is applying our methodology to a city, the city of London. So look out for that.
Well, it is really interesting. I think we'd kind of been like kicking this idea around for a little while, and we have a very set way of looking at the nation state, and we apply a pretty rigid geopolitical model to it. So we just kind of thought, well, what if we did that to a city? What's a good city? What's an important city? What's an old city? London kind of makes a lot of sense. So we're gonna roll out the geopolitics of London here pretty soon, and we're gonna see how it goes. And please feedback. We know you're not shy. I know you're not shy. So come with us with feedback. You like it? You don't like it? We'll see what happens. That'll be available to subscribers at some point in time. We're not quite ready for it. In fact, I think we're gonna go over it more in detail next week, but we've got some more ideas to kick around in that regard. We've also got something coming out next Sunday, I think.
Yes, in celebration of GPF's favorite holiday, we will be producing a piece on a topic that we will not reveal. I think we should just hint by saying to our readers that fear is the mind killer.
Right. It's just for fun. Again, we'd like to apply this model to a bunch of different things, and hopefully you guys like it. We like doing it. So without further ado, week ahead, what's going on? Middle East is on fire as it is. This should basically just be the Middle East roundup at the beginning of every podcast. Well, there's so much every time to say.
We had a reader write in earlier this week saying that you guys are focusing way too much on the Middle East. And on the one hand, I understand that it might feel that way because a lot of the content that we've been pushing out in the first quarter of this year has been on the Middle East. But when you sit down on Monday morning and you see that over the weekend, Turkey announced that it was going to be commencing operations in northern Iraq. Iraq said, no, you're not, and deployed its army there. You had unconfirmed reports in Arab media that said the Israelis had hit Hezbollah targets. You had Hezbollah denying, the Israelis pleading the fifth, basically. You had Houthi missiles flying into various parts of Saudi Arabia.
And last time that happened, flurry of activity thereafter. It's just one of those things.
So it's just there is a lot to get through, just from what happened over the weekend, to sift through what's important, what's not important, what's real, what's not real.
And it's a good point. We do appreciate the opinions of our readership, obviously, and we hear you. But we didn't force the retreat of the Islamic State and the ascension of Iran into some of those vacuums. They did that on their own. So we are consigned to talk about it.
Yes, and while all this is going on, and while we're figuring everything else out, we should note that coming up end of the week, beginning of next week, the leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Iran are going to get together for the first time in a while, and they have a great deal to talk about in the region. So, Middle East, a lot of stuff a lot of things going on.
Speaking of Russia, you want to talk about the diplomats?
Yes. So the other thing that we are watching right now is that, and you've probably seen this, a number of countries, not just the UK and the United States, now have expelled Russian diplomats. So the full list here is we have diplomats expelled from Canada, Germany, France, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Latvia, Estonia.
Not token countries. These are important. These are really important countries. These are big names.
Yes, and also there was some internal argument at GPF among the analyst team about whether or not Germany and France were going to go along with the UK and with a harsh response to Russia over this alleged spy poisoning in the UK. And it turns out that yes, they are going along. The EU, perhaps not the entire EU, but large blocks of the EU are all signing on to express displeasure with Russia. Russia has said it will respond reciprocally and considers all of this nonsense. It may be that's where this ends. This may be just another diplomatic kerfuffle that declines into history and we don't remember it in a year's time. But we're looking at really all these different countries, what they're doing, and whether there are blocks now forming within the EU for those countries that I didn't name that haven't expelled any.
Well, either way, unanimity is the name of the game in the EU, right? And so either way, it doesn't really bode well for sanctions relief for Russia. So,
Exactly. And then, last but not least, we cannot forget the dear leader over in North Korea. North Korea has been relatively quiet lately. It has been understanding of South Korea and its needs to, continue strong relations with the United States. But South Korea let it be known that they wanted to deploy some F-35 fighter jets and buy more missiles from the United States. And a North Korean newspaper came out strongly criticizing South Korea, saying that South Korea was jeopardizing the spirit of peace and reconciliation that had so far obtained on the Korean Peninsula.
so you're saying a peace agreement is not a foregone conclusion?
Well, I don't think I hope I never said that it was a foregone conclusion.
No, I mean I'm being a little smug, I guess, but you didn't read those words verbatim in the media, but you got the sense that like, wow, this is a new chapter. This is the turning of the tide. This is a new thing, and there are some of us out there who are like, well, maybe not so fast.
Well, it's a new chapter. Whether it's the turning of the tide, we don't know. All we can say right now is, most of the time North Korea says crazy things all the time. Right now, saying this thing at this particular time might be important. Now, it might be that this is within the realm of what North Korea considers polite disagreement. But this really is the first sort of major blip in the last couple of weeks where North Korea has very loudly made its displeasure vocalized. So we'll have to see where that goes and whether it was just a small expression of disapproval or whether North Korea, perhaps in the wake of John Bolton's appointment, is reconsidering options.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I want to bring up one point before we forge ahead into our feature segment. Like last week, it was pre-recorded, right? So me and Jacob and Xander Snyder sat down and we kind of wanted to talk about the Middle East. But it turns out a lot of things that we wanted to talk about were sort of revolving specifically around Turkey. So we kind of called an audible and focused specifically on that. Now, the reason I want to bring that up right now is, again, it's pre-recorded, so this is kind of like non-linear. So hopefully it doesn't come off that way and there are no questions. And on that note, I remember we brought up the possibility of Turkish troops in Sinjar, to which Jacob just alluded. So at that point, Iraq hadn't even really responded very much. They hadn't sent troops. So just if that's unclear in any way, I want to make sure everybody knows we didn't get around back to editing and it's already done. It's in production and it's over. The podcast, not the actual conflict, that continues apace. And without further ado, let's cut to me and you and Xander talking about Turkey. Okay, great. Joining us is Xander Snyder out from California. Xander, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Cole?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Jacob is here, as always. Now, the last time we three gentlemen got together, we spoke at great length about the Syrian civil war. Turns out that's still going on, and they haven't resolved it quite yet. So that gives us an opportunity to explore this, at length again. However, there's a whole lot going on with one specific aspect of one specific actor in the Syrian civil war, and that is Turkey. So much so, in fact, I kind of wanted to make this sort of kind of like a sequel to our previous conversation, but I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense because there's so much that's kind of happened subsequently since they've tied up operations in Afrin. So that is kind of a long-winded way to say that we're going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of Turkey. Now, Turkey is a pretty important player in our model. We kind of see it as a country on the rise, and some of its behavior in Syria is emblematic of its ascension, more or less. So I'll turn it over to you first, Xander. What happened last week, right? So when we last left off with Turkey, they had invaded Afrin and they've kind of taken it over now. What's next in that regard, and where does that now put them with some of their friends and allies in the region?
Sure. So Afrin has fallen. The operation that began in late January is effectively over. It seems like the YPG, which is sort of the main militia, Syrian Kurdish militia, has fled and has pulled back and basically turned over the area to the Turks. The a YPG spokesman made an announcement basically saying, okay, fine, we're resorting to guerrilla warfare now, but effectively they can't put up a fight anymore. So Afrin has fallen to the Turks. And since then, Turkey continues to make announcements that it's going to be moving on Manbij, which is a city just a little further east than Afrin city. And this is consequential, as we've written about, because while the U.S. effectively green-lighted Turkey's invasion of Afrin, because there are no anti-ISIS operations going on there, the U.S. has made it very clear that its support of the YPG fighters and forces based in Manbij is going to continue. The U.S. has a presence there, and it supports those Kurds, and is not going to pull that support back. And Turkey keeps saying, okay, well, it's really important for us to clear our border with northern Syria of this Kurdish presence. So now we're kind of waiting to see how conversations, dialogues between the U.S. and Turkey work out.
So if I read you right, it sounds like it's pitting Turkey against the United States over this issue, not militarily, of course, but something's got to give, right? And so, in fact, and Jacob, correct me if I'm wrong, there were recent statements, I want to say today or yesterday, where the U.S. said we're not going anywhere in Manbij, correct?
Well, it's all very unclear, and the resignation or forcing out of Rex Tillerson makes it even more unclear, and McMaster also doesn't make this particularly clear. So, just yesterday you had a State Department spokesperson saying the U.S. has not agreed to leave Manbij. The U.S. forces will remain on the ground there. You had a phone call between Trump and Erdogan, and the White House readout of that phone call was pretty vanilla, as most White House readouts are. But Erdogan made a speech a little bit later where he said, look, I talked to U.S. President Donald Trump today, and I talked to Russian President Vladimir Putin 2 days ago, and I told them that Syria is not leaving. This is not like before when we sort of dipped our toes into the water of Syria and then withdrew. We're in Afrin, and then we're in this for the long haul. We're going to keep going. And you've had this sort of back and forth with the Turkish foreign minister and the United States State Department, where it's like, well, is there an understanding? Is there an agreement? There's even, fighting about the difference between understandings and agreements between those two offices. So all that to say, there's a major problem here for Turkey. Turkey has committed itself into northern Syria. If Turkey is going to commit itself into northern Syria, it has to do more than Afrin. And the United States has, forces on the ground in Syria and has been supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Kurds generally. And that is going to lead to a problem between the United States and Turkey. And we talked about this last time. The moment at which I start to worry about issues like this is when one side is backed up against the wall, and they've put themselves in the situation where they can't save face. If Erdogan is going out there and saying, no, we're in this, we have to take over this part of northern Syria in order to protect Turkish interests, and the United States is saying, well, no, we can't do that because that's going to ruin our credibility and that's going to ruin the fight against ISIS, and by the way, we don't particularly like Turkey telling the United States what to do, you start to get the makings of a real break in relations. Now, Xander, I would put it to you, neither one of us thinks that Turkey is quite ready to go this far yet, but I will say that Turkey is pushing the envelope pretty hard.
Yeah, and I think the discrepancy that you mentioned, Jacob, is worth just repeating for clarity's sake, where there have been ongoing negotiations between the U.S. and Turkey, of course, and in the last 1 or 2 weeks, we've pretty persistently seen either Turkish leaders like Cavusoglu or Turkish state media repeating that an agreement has been reached with the U.S., and the U.S., we've had no announcement to that effect in the U.S., and in fact, I think it was a spokesperson from the State Department that came out and said unequivocally that had not happened. So we're getting very different messaging from both sides of the negotiating table between these two allies. Now, as far as why we don't think Turkey is really truly ready to challenge the U.S., a lot of it has to do with Turkey's relationship with Russia. So Turkey and Russia have been historical enemies. They've fought a number of wars stretching back to the 16th century, but really heating up in the 18th century with a number of different fairly major engagements that resulted in, or at least contributed to, a material decline in the strength of the Ottoman Empire. And part of this is just because they're right next to each other. So they have some competing interests geographically. Now, right now, Turkey and Russia have been cooperating, and we expect them to continue sort of a pragmatic set of relations in the course of the next year as Turkey kind of works out its role in Syria, and Russia basically let Turkey use airspace in Afrin to support its invasion there. So we know some sort of cooperation is going on, but ultimately Turkey and Russia cannot be friends, right? They're going to have competing interests. And we think that until Turkey develops its military power, and well, frankly, its economic stability as well, to the point where it can support that military power, in order to confront Russia independently, not necessarily with an invasion, but in order to basically hold its own, we think until Turkey gets to that point, it will remain dependent on U.S. support to some degree. So while they might be talking big and saying, we're going to march on Manbij regardless of whether the U.S. is still there or not, we think that that's probably right now more Turkey trying to generate some degree of leverage in negotiations with the U.S. rather than a legitimate threat.
I agree with all that, and I just want to add two things to it. The first is this is a great example of how countries and leaders don't get to make decisions like this out of a place from what they want. Turkey didn't really want to get dragged into northern Syria and was resisting being dragged into northern Syria for a long time. And when you're thinking about our long-term forecast, which I think is pretty well associated with us, which is Turkey, sort of the rising power in the Middle East, if you're looking at how that forecast plays out, you're watching it play out right now. It wasn't like there was some, secret mastermind in Ankara or in Istanbul deciding that Turkey was now going to conquer Syria or the rest of the Middle East. What happened was Syria went into civil war, and the security threat to Turkey became so intolerable that Turkey decided that it needed to do something. Not the only equivalent, but one equivalent that comes to my mind is, what if you're looking at the United States and the border with Mexico develops into a civil war with radical groups blowing things up and moving across the border at will and creating cells on the other side of the border? You can bet that would draw the United States into a conflict that it didn't want to be involved in either. So the first thing is just, a lot of people think of Turkey making aggressive moves forward. It's being pulled in. And a part of the reason that we think of Turkey as a power that is going to be involved in the Middle East is because it's going to be drawn in. It can't resist it. And then the second thing is, I was just thinking about this when we were talking about some of the differences between negotiations and agreements and what Turkey is saying, what the United States is saying. I think we should keep in mind we're in the Middle East, and one of my favorite stories to tell about the Middle East is not Bashar al-Assad, but Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father. There's a story about how he was in a negotiation, and I believe it was Henry Kissinger who said of Hafez that he was the only negotiator he ever did any business with, where instead of going right to the end of the cliff and sort of threatening to jump off of it, Hafez al-Assad would launch himself off the cliff knowing that he could grab onto a stick on the way down to hold himself off. The point being that if Turkey is in a negotiation with the United States, there is still room, I think, to say, okay, there's a lot of posturing here. Turkey is just making itself very clearly known and sees disorder in the White House, sees inconsistency in the White House, and has to make sure the White House knows exactly what Turkey wants and how far it's willing to go. That doesn't necessarily mean that Turkey is willing to back it up, but I have to say that there's been enough happening to where I'm beginning to get a little shaky on that.
Right, and let's not forget either that one of the reasons it's getting pulled in to Syria, not maybe the reason, but one of the big reasons is Iran, which we haven't even really touched on yet either. And it's not in Turkey's interest to see a pro-Iran or Iran-friendly regime propped up in Syria, which the Assad regime essentially is. Which is also why you've seen, and Xander, maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit, why we've seen Turkish deployments actually in northern Iraq too, which is, Iraq's got a complicated relationship with Iran, but it's generally a friendlier state too, and it's deploying Turkish forces there under the auspice of fighting Kurdish groups there as well. So what you have is Turkish forces fighting Kurds in northwest Syria, right? And then you've got Manbij in the middle, and then you've also got Turkish forces deployed in Iraq. Or they might even be pro-Turkish militias. You can correct all of my mistakes, Andrew, here in 1 second once I actually get to a point. But then you have Turkey like in Iraq trying to make Iran sweat a little bit too. Yeah.
I think it is correct and accurate to say that Turkey is legitimately concerned about the Kurdish presence along its border in Syria. I think it is also correct to say that Turkey is using that as justification to acquire more territory, even though it keeps claiming that it doesn't want to be an occupying force in Syria, in order to weaken Assad's position, thereby weakening Iran's position. So that's what's going on in Syria. And as Assad continues to consolidate his power over the country, and gradually the war has been going in his favor with Russian and Iranian support, Turkey sees essentially a shrinking window of opportunity where it can say, okay, well, there are these terrorists on our border. We have to do something now. There's this crazy civil war. And in that sense, they are getting sucked into it. But they are also making the conscious effort to minimize the threat from Iran, which has really emerged from the civil war of the last several years and really the best position compared to other Middle Eastern regional powers. It now has really substantial influence in Iraq, not omnipotent power, but it is in control of a large number of militias in Iraq, and of course directly supports Assad as well as a number of militias, including Hezbollah in Syria. So that's what's going on in Syria. In Iraq, there does seem to be a deployment of Turkish forces to the east of Sinjar, and this region, Sinjar, is where the PKK, which is the Kurdish terrorist group that even the U.S. recognizes is a terrorist group, is stationed, or it has a substantial presence. So Turkey, we've seen some reports of Turkey increasing its deployment to the east of this region in a town called Sidakan and another called Soran. Some reports of paratroopers being deployed from helicopters, and we've really seen sort of not ambiguous, but contradictory statements coming from the Iraqi government as to their sentiment of the Turkish deployment there. We saw one day, I think it was Wednesday this week, where there were reports that the Iraqi government was totally okay with this Turkish deployment, and literally the next day, an Iraqi spokesperson came out and said, no, we entirely reject the Turkish presence in Iraq. But to your point, part of what Turkey is trying to do here is take out the PKK in Iraq. Part of what they're trying to do is show Iran that they can play the same game. And if Iran is in Syria on Turkey's border, Turkey can be in Iraq on Iran's border.
Well, there are two different things going on here, and I want to simplify it maybe a little bit for the listeners. First, there is the relationship between Turkey and Iran. And if you're going to talk about the relationship between Turkey and Iran, one of the first things you have to talk about are Kurds. Because there are Kurds in Turkey, and there are Kurds in Syria and Iraq, and there are Kurds in Iran. Iran was actually the only time there was an independent Kurdish state. It lasted for like 2 or 3 years. It's way back in the 1940s, I think. It was a very short-lived experiment in Iran. You saw pragmatic cooperation between Turkey and Iran last year against various Kurdish aspirations for independence. The problem is when you look at the historical model, it's not that Iran and Turkey cooperate to put down Kurdish independence. What Turkey and Iran usually do is they use different Kurdish groups to fight against each other. And I would imagine that as this develops and as you see Iran try to encroach more and more upon a sphere of influence that Turkey is showing us that it thinks is a Turkish sphere of influence and not an Iranian sphere of influence, I think you will begin to see Iran trying to use its Shiite militias and some of the proxy groups that Xander was just talking about, and whatever Kurdish groups it can motivate against Turkey. Turkey will try to do the same thing to Iran. People write in to us and ask about the Kurds all the time. This great power competition between Turkey and Iran is going to suck for the Kurds.
Yeah.
They're really caught in between, and unless the Kurds can unify, if all those different groups in those different countries can come together and try and get some kind of unified sense of what's going on, the problem for these various Kurdish groups is they are just not strong enough to resist. And they are historically vulnerable to having one patron that uses them against another patron. So Turkey and Iran is really sort of the bigger clash that's happening here at the broad 30,000 foot altitude. Did I say that right? Feet altitude? Foot altitude.
It's really high up.
It's really
just high up,
from
high
a
level,
really high
like
level.
that, right?
You know, this is going to come down to Turkey versus Iran and some other countries maybe on the periphery that, I don't know. Cole, do you want to move us on? Or?
I actually do. That I think we actually stumbled into like a very sensible transition here. And so like if we're going to say, you know, Turkey and its international dealings, it's starting to butt heads a little bit with the United States, as Xander pointed out, like, you know, historical enmity with Russia. They don't get along with Iran very well, and they use Kurds, you know, to their advantage, which is just like, it's like so interesting to me too. Like we use the words allies a lot, but like just because you use a hammer to hammer in a nail doesn't make the hammer your ally. It's just something you're using, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind. But there's all these other, I mean, there's a lot of other actors in the Middle East. So let's talk about some of them, right? Let's talk about Turkey's relations with some of these people. Starting with anywhere. I mean, if things aren't good between Turkey and Iran right now, I think a logical place to start is how do Turkey and Saudi Arabia see each other right now? How do they interact? How do they get along? How do they do what they do?
Well, the unsaid thing in Cole's question was that as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, it was Turkish foreign policy to have zero problems with neighbors. And it now seems like it's
always have as many problems with neighbors as you possibly can.
Which again
right.
goes to this notion that you can't choose.
Right.
But look, the different countries that are both opposed and for or ambivalent about Turkey, it depends where they are. I think Saudi Arabia is probably long-term uncomfortable with Turkey expanding into the region. At the same time, I think Saudi Arabia would rather deal with Turkey than with Iran, and is certainly happy that Turkey seems to be stepping into that role of a country that is going to push back against some of Iran's moves right now. You have also seen Egypt, though, another of the two major Arab powers still left standing in this crazy region, also has at least made statements about how it does not like what Turkey is doing. Of course, that makes sense. Turkey is encroaching upon the Arab world, and any Arab state is going to be nervous about that. The thing that Turkey has going for it is that Turkey is still a Sunni country, and it does have this historical legacy of having ruled much of this region. And I would note that one of the reasons Turkey is relying so much on proxy groups in Syria and using its soldiers and its air force mainly to back up Syrian Arab rebel groups that are against Assad is because Turkey knows that even a country like Syria is not going to welcome Turkish presence there. The relationships that Turkey has to develop with Sunni Arab countries has to be on some level an issue maybe of mutual respect. Turkey doesn't want to go in and occupy all of these places. And Turkey has an advantage versus an adversary like Iran, versus an adversary like Russia, because it is the only one that has been here before and has something in common with some of these other groups. So a lot of different countries are uncomfortable with Turkey for a lot of different reasons, some more than others, but I guarantee you that they are more comfortable with Turkey than they are with, say, Iran or any of these others dominating the region, and they are certainly happy now that there is at least some kind of balancing force in the center of the region. You feel that way, Xander?
Yeah, and I'll just add that as relates to Turkey-Egyptian relations, there is some historical precedent for Egypt to be wary of Turkey growing in power. For hundreds of years, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire, and while the form of administration changed over time, it wasn't always direct, but they ruled sort of through like a proxy person who was in charge there. And Egypt essentially began to become independent when Napoleon invaded in the late 18th century, and Muhammad Ali used the opportunity to kind of break away and become his own man.
Okay, Xander, another question for you here. So we haven't really talked much about Europe. Turkey has always kind of been this tweener state of is it an Asian country, is it a European country, and it's kind of always gone back and forth throughout history. So let's talk a little bit about its relations with Europe. They're a little, I don't know if I want to say fraught now, because there's some diplomatic tiffs and there's some very strong-worded statements being bandied about right now. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean between the European Union and Turkey right now?
Yeah, well, there are some very strongly worded statements, and then there are some actual developments, things that have happened. So on the strongly worded statement side, there's been sort of a diplomatic spat, if you want to call it that, about this agreement that the EU made with Turkey to sort of control the flow of refugees, and in return the EU would provide some funding to Turkey in the amount of 6 billion euros. And as I understand it, that 6 billion euros is going to be broken up into two tranches. Turkey claims it hasn't received all of the first tranche because the EU is only providing that aid through like specific projects, and Turkey wants the cash monies in its coffers. So that's kind of been that has come up in the last week or so, and that is the refugee issue is part of the diplomatic tension between Turkey and the EU right now. In terms of actual military developments, if we look at the Eastern Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus, which is bifurcated into a Greek Cyprus that everyone except Turkey, well, actually, I don't know if Turkey recognizes Greek Cyprus, but northern Cyprus is a Turkish Cyprus that's only recognized by Turkey, and no one else recognizes it as legitimate because they see Turkey as having invaded Cyprus in 1974 and taken it through force. Now, because Turkey recognizes Turkish Cyprus, they're basically saying, okay, well, we have right to certain areas of Cyprus's exclusive economic zone, which includes all the natural resources below it, which in the last 2 years, fairly large reserves of natural gas has been found. And when an Italian company, Eni, sent a drilling rig to begin exploration in one of these blocks that Turkey claims, Turkey sent warships and blocked it. And when the drilling ship made another attempt, Turkey blocked it with even more warships. So Turkey has, everyone's calling it gunboat diplomacy, but Turkey is deploying naval force to prevent Europe from exploiting resources that it considers to be its own. And in response, the EU has again issued some very stern warnings and aggressive finger wagging in Turkey's direction. But so far, nothing has happened in terms of confrontation. Turkey has recently, as I understand, either sent or is about to send a drilling ship to these blocks in the exclusive economic zone around Cyprus that it claims is theirs. I imagine an attempt to execute some sort of fait accompli where it's just there and there's nothing that you can do about it. But as Turkey grows in power, history shows us that it really has to go in both directions, because unlike, say, the U.S., that is buffeted on both sides by ocean, Turkey is buffeted on both sides by potentially aggressive enemies that neighbor the Eastern Mediterranean, and then, of course, the land borders to the east. So that is increasingly bringing it into confrontation with Greece, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the key point to make, and Cole, you kind of alluded to it. Turkey is not just a Middle Eastern country. When we think about Turkey, certainly its power is felt most in the Middle East, but Turkey is also a European country, no matter what Europe wants to say about it. And the fact that you have countries in the Balkans that are becoming either uncomfortable or pragmatic about Turkey's interests in that part of the world. You have countries on the Mediterranean that are, as Xander alluded to, an Italy, a France, Spain. All these countries are keeping an eye on what Turkey is doing. I would point out that Turkey has a larger population than any of those countries that I just mentioned. So when you think about Turkey, right now it is certainly being pulled into northern Syria, and that has to be where the bulk of Turkish activity is going. But if Turkey is going to become more independent and is going to pursue a more independent foreign policy, you can bet that you will see that manifest itself in Europe. But I wonder if Cole might let me segue for just a second and say, I think one of the biggest arresters to that in the short term is the Turkish economy, which no matter what you look at, whether it's IMF or the Bank of International Settlements, or even if you want to go through Turkish government data, which is a chore, I don't wish it upon anyone, you will see that Turkey has some serious problems in the economy, ranging from the development of crony capitalism, as Erdogan has had to increase his control over the government, to debt issues. I saw the lira was at a 16-month low on the dollar just today, although that probably has something to do with Trump and his tariffs. But Xander, you've been following this issue, and you've actually called some of these developments before they actually happen. So where do you think the Turkish economy is right now? And I'm curious how you think that might affect Turkey's moves in Syria or its ambitions in Southern Europe.
Sure. Well, I think certainly we can look to the natural gas reserves off Cyprus and say, well, Turkey has always wanted to be an energy exporter to Europe, and if it could control reserves that the chief executive of the Italian company Eni said could supply all of Europe, then that would be an added relief to the economic challenges that Turkey's facing and just more money in its coffers. It would also potentially be a lever on Russia, but that's kind of a different story. There's a lot going on with the Turkish economy right now. A lot of it stems from Erdogan's desire to generate as much growth as possible politically, because growth provides more jobs, makes everyone happy, gets him reelected. And he's been doing that by encouraging low interest rates, although I say low interest rates relatively because the deposit rate in Turkey is still like 12%, so it's much higher than the US. But the problem with relatively low interest rates is twofold. One, it generates inflation, which is why we have seen, in part, the lira becoming weaker, and why the central bank has generally been advocating against Erdogan's wishes to raise interest rates in order to strengthen the lira. And the central bank wants to do that because, in order to finance this current account deficit and keep the economy growing, Erdogan has essentially Turkey has had to resort to a lot of external debt financing. And that the problem with external debt is it's fine so long as your currency remains strong, but if your currency becomes much weaker relative to the dollar and you have to repay your debt in dollars, all of a sudden it becomes far more expensive for Turkey to service its debt in lira. So the Turkish central bank wants to raise the strength of the lira by increasing interest rates in order to prevent the debt burden from becoming out of hand, while Erdogan wants to keep interest rates low to keep Turkey growing. And the net result is 11% inflation right now. External debt remains high. Turkey is trying to pay it down, but it's doing it in very small amounts and not very effectively. So that's a lot of what the IMF noticed when they released the report earlier this week, and it's something that we covered in pretty good detail back in a deep dive in December. And I think if I were to summarize all of this, I would say Turkey is, I don't think, at an imminent crisis point when it comes to its economy, but the external debt adds substantial risk to its economic position. And of course, if something catastrophic were to happen to Turkey's economy, or even if it were just to if its growth were to slow substantially, that would impair its ability to fund its military activities. So its economic position impairs and influences its ability to project power both in the Eastern Mediterranean and through the Middle East.
And one of the interesting things that comes from what you're saying is that when you look at both Turkey and Iran, both of them are facing domestic issues that will hamper their ambitions in the greater region. If you look domestically inside Turkey, you still have a state of emergency. You still have reorganization of media companies. The attempted coup was not that long ago. Iran, we saw earlier this year, had a spate of protests, has an internal competition between hardliners and conservatives and pragmatists, and we don't need to go into all that here. But this is just to say that as we're looking at the competition emerging between Turkey and Iran in the Middle East, for example, I think a lot of how that competition is going to be resolved in the next few years is who can deal with their internal problems better. And if you're looking at Turkey's relationship with Southern Europe, I think it actually has a lot more to do with how confident and strong Turkey is feeling, not just from a military perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So we can talk a lot about the fundamentals of Turkish power and how it's dealing at the international level, but internally, Turkey is in a very strong place of dynamic flux. I hate myself that I just said the phrase dynamic flux.
You're not alone.
What does that mean? But I'm just saying that when you see Turkey and when you're looking at Turkey from the outside, I see a society that isn't quite sure what it wants to be. Does it want to just defend Turkey? Does it feel like it needs to go into other countries to secure its interests? What is going to be the relationship between Islam and a secular government there? What is going to be the relationship between the media and the government there? What is the role of the military right now? The military had most of its officers, well, not most of its officers, but a number of its officers replaced in that attempted coup. So, none of what we're saying here means that Turkey is on the verge of taking over the world, and I hope that we never have sounded like that. I would just say that you see Turkey getting pulled into northern Syria, even as Turkey internally, I think, is under a great deal of stress.
Well, and I think another question worth asking too is that form of governance they have what they want to go with moving forward? And you alluded to the media, and we just read a report today or yesterday about that. Do you want to expand on that? Right, we have a little bit more time before we go. If you want to talk about that a little bit, you noted about how difficult it can be to get some Turkish data. We have reason to believe through some media acquisitions that it's going to be perhaps a little bit more difficult to get more reliable, unbiased reporting out of Turkey. Go.
Well, look, this is the question I get a lot, and this is why does there seem to be the rise of strongman leaders all over the world?
I didn't want to say strongman, but
I know you hate the word strongman, but you do have these leaders who are generating pretty rabid support from different groups of a population, and then are trying to increase their power so that they can make structural changes. We've seen this in China. We've seen this in Russia. We have seen this in the United States. I think that is some of the impulse behind the election of Donald Trump. We've seen this in a number of different places. Turkey is no exception. And Erdogan, I think, for some in Turkey, represents stability, represents power, represents somebody who sees the challenges that Turkey is facing and recognizes that you have to give a leader power in order to make things happen. I think there are other parts of Turkey that are profoundly uncomfortable with the direction that Erdogan is steering Turkey. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question. I would just point out that Turkey, like a number of other different countries, has these internal stresses that are pushing Turkey in a number of different directions, and one of the outcomes of that has been a great deal of support for Erdogan, who has used that to increase his political power. Now, I will say, what if some kind of massive economic crisis in the world happens and Turkey is at the forefront of it because of its debt? What happens in Turkey if there is a major economic or financial crisis? I don't think we can say that Erdogan's rule is completely secure. I don't know in 10 years' time if the government that runs Turkey today is going to be the government that runs Turkey in 10 years. And I mean that both in terms of the personalities and the actual structure. What I can tell you is that the challenges for Turkey will probably be the same. But as for whether it's going to be Erdogan, whether it's going to be this presidential system, whether there's going to be another military attempt, that's the type of stuff that nobody can really predict. And anybody who can, I think, is selling you false goods. What I will say is that when all the dust settles, where Turkey is positioned internationally should leave it in a stronger position in 10 years than it's at.
Real quick, I just want to quickly correct myself. I said earlier when I was talking about the Turkish economy, an IMF report. It wasn't an IMF report. It was a Moody's credit downgrade that happened earlier this week. So that's the report I meant to refer to.
Unfortunately, I think that's about all the time we have today. And it's probably as good a place as any to stop. Do y'all have any parting thoughts? Any last words? Last word sounds a little macabre. I don't mean nobody's going to shuffle off this mortal coil just yet, but anything you want to say to me or Xander or to our listeners before you go?
The thing that I want to say is just, I'm so glad that people have been listening to this podcast, and we've actually been getting more listeners, a little bit of an increase in hate mail too, but also more listeners as we've come to a more steady format. I don't want to shill for the website that we all work for, but I would just say that, we write for geopoliticalfutures.com. All the thoughts and analysis that we do here are enabled by that business and by the work that we do there. If these conversations interest you, I'd encourage you to check us out. We have some free offerings. We also have paid offerings if you want to make the full commitment. This is really, all of that builds off of the work we do there. So we appreciate you all listening, but come check us out if you haven't already.
Okay, that's enough. That's all for today. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
For more geopolitical insights from the team at Geopolitical Futures, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter using the link in the description.